It's my pleasure to welcome for our fourth paper session, Dr. J. Phelan, Senior Professor of Theological Studies here at North Park, and responding to his paper, Rebekah Eklund, Assistant Professor of Theology at Loyola in Baltimore. It's with special gratitude that we invite Jay to hear Jay's paper, who's graciously stepped in and written a paper for this session where there was a gap. So we welcome Jay.
Thank you. Well, I've got the coveted middle of the afternoon right after lunch. As Hannah says, I had not expected to be here at this time. About 3 weeks ago, at least I didn't expect to be here. But I made the mistake of going in and talking enthusiastically to Klein about my interest and excitement about things I was reading as I was getting ready to work with the students for this particular symposium. And I was having a discussion with Klein, having a discussion with Stephen. So the next thing I know, Klein is saying, maybe you want to write a paper on this. And as I say at the beginning of the paper, I enter into this with a bit of trepidation because I am, as Wendell Berry talks about the danger of our academic world producing a race of learned mincers whose propriety and pride is to keep their minds inside their fields, as if human thoughts were a kind of livestock to be kept out of the woods and off the roads. Here I am. I have wandered rather far into the woods, but I have found it to be a very evocative and exciting read, investigating one of the most important figures with regard to the question of human initiative, human agency, and that's Augustine of Hippo. And I couldn't read this whole paper in the time allotted if I wanted to, and nor would you want me to. So I will be skipping around through this and hopefully enabling you to keep the thread as I do so. Few people have influenced the West and the Western Church more than this great North African. And perhaps no one had greater influence on the conundrum of human agency than he. Throughout the centuries, those arguing for obviously contradictory notions of free will, predestination, original sin, have cited Augustine as authoritative. And these debates continue up to this very day, as the Symposium illustrates. But as I worked my way through the conflicts of the late 4th and early 5th century, I began to wonder if the conflict between Augustine, Pelagius, Prosper, and Cassian, and many others, was really about human agency in the first place. Were these often fierce arguments displaced from a more serious set of questions that was plaguing a church in transition? And I'm, of course, not alone in wondering about this. But if this is true, what was this argument really about, and what conclusions may we draw for the life of the church? In this next section, I illustrate the post-Augustinian situation with the story of John Scotus Erigena and Gottschalk, a Saxon who in the 9th century was preaching a double predestination. I don't have time to read all this, although it's a really interesting story and it's really kind of fun because they're all concerned about Gottschalk's preaching, so they haul in Erigena to write a response to him. And then when he writes his response, they become more concerned about him than they were about Gottschalk in the first place. So at any rate, you can read that at your leisure. The terms, page 6, the terms of the conversation have not shifted a great deal over the centuries. Calvin and Pelagius, Luther and Erasmus wrestle over the very same ground 1,000 years after Augustine and Pelagius and 700 years after Gottschalk and Erigena. And the issues are as alive today as they were in the 5th century Hippo and 16th century Geneva. Nevertheless, in spite of all the theological and philosophical wrangling of Augustine and Pelagius, and so on, the real issue, I suggest, was pastoral. It addressed a question very much alive in the monasteries of Gaul and North Africa, as well as the churches of Rome and Hippo. How is one to live as a Christian? This, I think, was the real question that they were facing. The Western Church in the late 4th and early 5th centuries was experiencing a time of dramatic change and upheaval. The old Roman political and civic order was eroding. Barbarian invasions, violence, and war threatened the settled life of towns, as well as the emerging power of the church. By the early 6th century, Robert Marcus argues the culture and society that had fostered Augustine and his peers had been replaced by a culture and society that could properly be called medieval. It is, of course, difficult to say how the conflicts and chaos of those decades impacted the thinking of the main subjects of this study, but they were not writing in a vacuum, and the key question was not simply how one understands grace and nature or God's sovereignty and human will, but as I suggested above, how one lives as a Christian. In this next section, I describe how Augustine, as a young man, had this vision for a monastic community that began really before he was baptized, and that his vision of a monastic community was what Peter Brown calls a life of philosophical detachment, and that in the various permutations of this monastic existence that he lived in basically for the rest of his life, his vision of the monastic life was more of some talented, intellectual young men drawing aside to reflect on God, on God's Word, on theology, and so forth. And I go over this to illustrate how very differently Augustine experienced that form of monasticism in compared to the monasticism that came from the East, and particularly was represented in Gaul in the late 4th and early 5th century. Down to the bottom of page 9. Eastern monasticism made its way west and had perhaps the greatest impact in Gaul. On an island near Marseille, a new community was founded. According to Brown, it was the most successful of island monasteries that had been chosen for their sheer horror. So you had this notion of the monastery, even when it was in a more or less urban setting in Gaul near Marseille, as representing the eastern desert. So you look to find an island that would represent the kind of horror of the desert. In Gaul, page 10, in Gaul the result was a two-tiered notion of Christianity. There were the saints of the monasteries and the ordinary laypersons of the cities and the countryside. With Brown, the writings that came from Marseille and other places concentrated to an unusual degree on defining the boundary between the new demands of the ascetic movement and the average Christianity of the well-to-do secular persons. The presence of these ascetic communities alongside cultivated laypersons and local bishops provoked constant debate as to which Christianity was authentic and which was a half-hearted compromise. Equally vigorous was the debate among monks themselves as to who were the true monks and who were tepid amateurs. The situation generated arguments on almost every aspect of Christian behavior and of Christian society, from the nature of grace and free will to the fate of the Roman Empire. But however these monks understood and answered these questions, they were convinced that there was an advantage to their life of rigorous asceticism. They were convinced that they were the spiritual elites of the world, separated from the spiritual dilettantes by poverty, virginity, obedience, and so forth. All of this was called into question then by the conflict between Pelagius and Augustine. It's bitterly ironic that Pelagius, a man of scrupulous morality and, at least to his way of thinking, confident orthodoxy, should become perhaps the arch heretic of the Catholic and, for that matter, the Protestant Church. Subsequent to his condemnation, orchestrated by Augustine and his friends, his name has been used as an epithet and a warning. B.R. Rees observes, for centuries now, the adjective Pelagian has been a convenient term of abuse in the Christian church, and Pelagius himself a bogeyman for upright clerics to evoke when wanting to frighten wayward members of the flock. If you look at the list of people who have been accused of being Pelagian, semi-Pelagian, or synergistic, it's a very long and distinguished list. 14th century Archbishop Thomas Bradwardine, Rees continues, detected a Pelagian hiding beneath every academic gown, just as Reinhold Niebuhr in the 20th century America saw Pelagians in every pew. Charges of semi-Pelagianism perhaps even cost Cassian, whom Rees calls one of the most attractive of the Western Fathers, official status as a saint, although many people still refer to him as one. Pelagius came to Rome from Britain as a moral reformer. To Pelagius, the Catholic Church, both at center and periphery, was compromised and morally flaccid. In his magisterial biography of Augustine, Peter Brown observes that Pelagius had no patience with the confusion that seemed to reign on the powers of human nature. He and his supporters wrote for men who wanted to make a change for the better. He refused to regard the power of self-improvement as having been irreversibly prejudiced. The idea of an original sin that could make men incapable of not sinning even more struck him as quite absurd. He was annoyed by the way in which Augustine's masterpiece, The Confessions, seemed merely to popularize the tendency toward a languid piety. In spite of this, Rees points out in the letters of Pelagius and his followers, Pelagianism was not a coherent system, not a coherent theological statement. Its adherents had widely divergent views on a wide range of subjects. As Brown puts it, Pelagianism as we know it, that consistent body of ideas of momentous consequences, had come into existence, but in the mind of Augustine, not Pelagius. Augustine saw serious theological problems lurking in the icy Puritanism and heroic individualism of Pelagius. Pelagius' views are well illustrated in his letter to Demetrius. Demetrius was a wealthy young woman who had forgone marriage for a life of virginity and devotion to God. She was only one of a circle of women and men who were wealthy young Romans who were making this kind of commitment, to whom Pelagius and other people like Jerome wrote letters at about the same time. And Pelagius offers Demetrius a bracing challenge to obedience and faithfulness. He insists that she has within her, as do all humans, a capacity to do good and evil. And he goes on to state in his words that his conviction that God had implanted in each person the capacity to do both good and evil. This ability to choose between good and evil was a gift of God's grace, as Pelagius saw it, and not destroyed by the fall of Adam. Such a pale notion of grace would not have satisfied Augustine. It was, Pelagius told Demetrius, an insult to God to imagine that he would give commands that humans were incapable of obeying of their own free will. What blind madness! What unholy foolishness! We accuse God of a twofold lack of knowledge, so that he appears not to know what he has done and not to know what he has commanded, as if forgetful of the human frailty of which he is himself the author, he has imposed on man commands which he cannot bear. And at the same time, O horror, we ascribe iniquity to the righteous and cruelty to the holy, while complaining first that he has commanded something impossible, secondly, that man is to be damned by him for doing things that he was unable to avoid, so that God, and this is something which even to suspect is sacrilege, seems to have sought not so much our salvation as our punishment. Augustine saw this as nothing less than an attack on divine grace. He insisted that human beings were not just damaged by Adam's sin, but fatally wounded, as you well know. Brown sums up the differences between Augustine and Pelagian with a fascinating analogy. Augustine had long been fascinated by babies. The extent of their helplessness had grown upon him ever since he wrote the Confessions. And in the Confessions, he had no hesitation in likening his relation to God to that of a baby to its mother's breast, utterly dependent, intimately involved in all good and evil that might come from this, the only source of life. Pelagius, on the other hand, was contemptuous of babies. Quote, "There is no more pressing admonition than this, that we should be called sons of God," he had written to Demetrius, a daughter of God, by the way. To be a son, Brown continues, was to be an entirely separate person, no longer dependent on one's father, but capable of following out one's own power, the good deeds that have been commanded. To use another, perhaps inapt analogy from the American political scene, Pelagius was a kind of theological libertarian, convinced that human beings should rise or fall on their own merits without support and interference of the government. Augustine, on the other hand, was an advocate of a kind of theological nanny state, where the individuals were able to progress only with the complete support of the institution of government, in this case, the grace of God and the church. Pelagius is not the only example in the earliest years of the church of that puritanical perfectionism, but he is the most prominent. Had his view of the Christian life prevailed, it's difficult to see how Christianity would have survived. On the other hand, Augustine could be accused of infantilizing ordinary Christians and tacitly, if unintentionally, encouraging a life of moral indifference. Many of his critics thought that this was exactly what he was doing. Robert Marcus argues that Augustine's attack on Pelagius, Julian of Eclanum, and others was a defense of Christian mediocrity. To be fair, it could also be called a defense of ordinary Christians. For Pelagius, though, there was no such thing. In the next section, I talk about how that Augustine's teachings stirred up some things among the monks in North Africa who saw his teachings as undermining their very way of life. If God had determined the course of their life, if God had determined who was to be saved and who was to be damned, and if their actions had no impact on their salvation whatsoever, why on earth were they monks in the first place? Why were they going through all this? And this, there was a flurry of letters that went back and forth between Augustine and this group of monks over this topic. And I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but I did, at the bottom of page 18, I wanted to read a really wonderful story that I think illustrates why the monks wrote their letter to Augustine. And one of the letters is about a monk, whether he's a critic or supporter of Augustine isn't clear, when rebuked by his abbot, suggested that since his actions were all determined by the foreknowledge and grace of God, if he had problems with him, the abbot should take it up with God. This, of course, illustrates nicely the problem within Augustinianism that had originally troubled the North African monks and would trouble Cassian and much later Hincmar of Reims and John Scotus Erigena. What use is moral striving and efforts to obey the law if everything is already determined? In what follows, I discuss Prosper of Aquitaine, who took up the defense of Augustine after Augustine's death, and particularly was involved in a conflict with John Cassian, particularly his 13th conference, in which Cassian argues for what has been called a semi-Pelagian or synergistic view of the relation between a divine and human agency, and that is that the grace of God notices the human being moving toward the good and rushes to support it. An approach and understanding of divine and human interaction which Augustine would definitely not have approved of. Page 21. Augustine has cast a long shadow for good and for ill. And perhaps nowhere has his shadow lingered as it has with regard to his complex teachings on original sin, predestination, grace, and free will. More than one scholar has argued that Augustine's particular formulation of the relationship between God's initiative and the human response was, in spite of his attempt to argue otherwise, an innovation. It was an innovation intended to slam the door on Pelagius's overly optimistic view of human capacities, his insistence that human beings could remain sinless, and his apparent denigration of the grace of God. Pelagius represented a genuine threat to the health and future of the church. His rigid perfectionism needed to be challenged, but Augustine's answer to the problem, in my opinion, created more problems than he, in the end, could solve. Although on paper at least, the church assented to Augustine's severity, in the pulpit, confessional booth, and pastor's office, the more generous views of Cassian frequently prevailed. Nevertheless, the monks, Pelagius and Augustine offered the church of the early 5th, late 4th and early 5th century, three distinct and enduring models of Christian living. First was the elitism of the monasteries. The monks' form of Christianity, they argued, was clearly superior to the run-of-the-mill Christians in Rome, Hippo, or Alexandria. They were closer to God, closer to salvation, closer to the truth. Augustine was rightly troubled by this dualism. How was he, as a pastor, to challenge the ordinary believers in Hippo to a form of faithfulness that was appropriate to their places in life, a faithfulness no less acceptable to that of the monks with whom he himself lived. A two-tiered Christianity did not seem appropriate to the expectation and experience of the apostles. The second form was the perfectionism of Pelagius. For him, there were not two classes of Christians, but one. His followers were committed to a ruthless obedience and flawless existence. They were bound to scorn both the ordinary Christians and the monks who lived by what they considered half measures. Perfectionism has always plagued the church. Throughout its history, perfectionists have preached their impossible ideal and looked with disdain on those apparently incapable of making the spiritual cut. The entirety of Protestantism could be viewed as a series of perfectionist movements that eventually moderated and settled into Marcus's Augustinian mediocrity. But such movements, like the poor, are always with us, and the perfectionist bifurcation continues unabated. Perfection being, to say the least, difficult to accomplish, whether perfection of life, theology, or practice, the calving of denominations will continue. Perhaps this Protestant tendency is the true outcome of Pelagianism. Finally, following elitism and perfectionism is indifferentism. Augustine was painfully aware of the awful muddle that was the church in Hippo. He saw regular folks, neither monastic elites nor Pelagian perfectionists, stumbling along, trying to be faithful, but liable to failing and falling. He recognized that wheat and tares were sown together, and that it was perilous to try to disentangle them. God knew who were His and would make that plain in due time. After all, it was not their good deeds and faithfulness that made the difference, but the sovereign choice of God before time began. This did not excuse him from preaching faithfully and offering the sacraments, especially that of baptism. It did not excuse them from the call to obedience, however obscure its origins and outcome. But in the end, it was all God. I have just a few minutes left, and I want to summarize a few things. My suggestion here is that the world of Augustine and Pelagius is a very different world from that of Paul, and that Paul's Jewish world did not have the same problem with human agency that Augustine and Pelagius did. And certainly Jews throughout their history have looked at this particular Christian problem of nature and grace and divine initiative and human agency as quite perplexing. And I cite a couple of things regarding that, and then on page 26 and following, some references to Maimonides, and then also to the very challenging critique of Christianity at the beginning of the 20th century by Leo Beck, who saw his particular understanding of Paulinism, which was filtered through German Lutheranism, as what he called Romanticism. Ultimately, it was Augustine's form of Christian faith that so troubled Maimonides and Beck. Augustine's rejection of Pelagius perfectionism involved a rejection of effective human agencies in spite of his arguments to the contrary. I simply see this as unavoidable. His insistence on predestination, original sin, and the determinative power of God's grace was seized on by Luther, Calvin, and other reformers to oppose what they saw as the Pelagian character of late medieval Catholicism. Though there were reactions to Luther's strictures among the Mennonites, Pietists, Methodists, and others, Protestantism has struggled ever since with the relation of works and obedience to God's will to salvation. More than once, this struggle has morphed into a form of antinomianism. Are elitism, perfectionism, and indifferentism the only options? Does Paul himself offer us another way to approach the question of how we should live? I would argue that my colleague Klein Snodgrass, and he told me when he read this that he was okay with a paper up until I started quoting that other guy, has offered us a way forward some 20 years ago in his article, Justification by Grace to the Doers, an analysis of the place of Romans 2 in the theology of Paul. An important article and well known among Pauline scholars. And many of them don't quite know what to do with it. And he goes on to have had difficulty with Romans 2. Paul's insistence that it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous is shocking to the ears to ears schooled on Augustine, Luther, and Calvin. One will find, Klein writes, statements ranging from a denial of that Paul believes judgment is according to works without respect to persons, to the assertion that words like 2:7 are only a foil in the argument against Jews, to the softening of such words by viewing them merely as missionary speech to awaken the conscience, or attempts to encourage ethical behavior. J.C. O'Neill admitted all of chapter 2 as irrelevant to Paul's purpose. One wonders why he put it in there then, but something we'd have to ask him. I will not repeat the argument of Klein's groundbreaking and still important article. I'd rather offer his conclusion. The final question, can Paul have believed that salvation is to the doer, must be answered with a resounding yes. One of the main problems that has led to such confusion in the study of Paul, and indeed in the church, is the inadequate and cognitive definitions that have been given of faith. And we've discussed that in the conference already. Any definition that does not do justice to the concept of obedience is unacceptable. Salvation is by grace, and people do not have to be godly or obedient before they come to God in Christ. But every part of Paul's writings would reject that they could remain ungodly in Christ. The righteousness of God includes that activity and power, showing how previous sins could be passed over, how sin is defeated, and how a life pleasing to God is now possible by the increased activity of the Spirit. I would add to this interpretation of Romans, Romans 2 fits well with another maligned and ignored text. You see, James wrote of Abraham that his faith and actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. Finally, to skip down to a couple of other comments about rethinking our communities as communities of practice. And that this is something you hear of quite a bit these days. And I would argue that the New Testament demonstrates, at least to me, that the early church was a community of practice. These practices were both communal and individual, were rooted in Torah, excluding what Paul called works of the law, that is, those elements of Torah that separated Jews and Gentiles. And all anticipated God's coming in judgment to set the world right. For Christians, these practices are shaped by the moral teachings of Torah, the commands of Jesus, the instructions of Paul, and the rest of the apostles. This complex set of instructions required rereading, reinterpretation, reapplication in every generation. And I mentioned here how we have the example of the rabbinic tradition where there was a constant rereading and reevaluation of the authoritative text in the present, and that they would have the main interpretation, the one that was a received interpretation, but they kept all the others that were not received because you never knew when you might need that one. Be that as it may, for Paul and his community, to live for God did not mean to live without sin, contra Pelagius. It did not mean to be a part of a small elite company, contra the monks. And it certainly did not mean to live as if the fate of every person was already determined, contra Augustine. It meant to live lives of obedience sustained by a community, and a community of practices. It's time to step out of the long shadow of Augustine. Our problem today is not the severe and icy Puritanism of Pelagius perfectionism. It is rather a placid, languidly pious individualism that rests upon past experiences. It is rather a lack of rigor, a failure of obedience. It is rather presumption on the grace of God than living by the grace of God. What would it mean to accept both the grace of God in Jesus Christ and the responsibility, the communal responsibility of being formed by the commands of God and the law of Christ? Well, thank you.
I want to thank Jay for his fine paper and also more especially for the privilege of responding to it. Although I've already complained to Jay that I expected a paper, say, on Paul or Revelation, and received instead a paper on semi-Pelagianism, which was a little bit of a shock to my system on Tuesday.
Well, it was to mine. So.
Like Jay, I am a New Testament scholar, which leads me to believe that New Testament scholars rush in where angels fear to tread. That is, into the debate between Augustine and Pelagius. But also like Jay, I am interested in the life that New Testament texts have taken on in the church and in theology over time. I've also been thinking a great deal about divine grace and human free will and the interplay between the two, because I'm currently teaching a book by Hans Urs von Balthasar called Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved, to a class of undergrads who are, for the most part, deeply uncomfortable with the idea of punishment in general and eternal damnation in particular. Von Balthasar, of course, issues his own direct challenge to the Augustinian tradition, which I will not rehearse here. Instead, I want to consider the main question that Jay's paper centers on, which is, how is one to live as a Christian? There's a wealth of interesting issues raised by Jay's paper, and in this brief space, I will pass over and ignore many of them, in order to focus on two. First, concerning the issue of justification and sanctification and the relationship between the two, and the problem of a two-tiered Christianity. And second, concerning the problem of indifferentism, and whether we are under an Augustinian shadow or a Pelagian one. So first, justification, sanctification, and two-tiered Christianity. One of my Jesuit friends reminded me when I told him that this is how I was going to be spending my afternoon, that the concept of a two-tiered system of Christianity was not necessarily inherent to the earliest models of the monastic life. In fact, the first monks often narrated themselves not as spiritual elites, but as the worst of sinners, as those most in need of salvation. Nonetheless, the specter of a two-tiered Christianity looms not just over the Pelagian debate, but over us today. This first reflection arises in part from the claim in Jay's paper that Pelagius's views on obedience necessarily means that the vast majority of Christians in the Roman world were damned, presumably because Pelagius thought one must be morally perfect, or at least very, very good, in order to achieve salvation. I wonder if a certain distinction between justification and sanctification might be helpful here. To be sure, too sharp a split between the two has caused its own problems and is difficult to support as a whole in the New Testament, particularly if justification is seen as essential and growth in holiness as somehow optional, if justifying is God's work and maturing ours. But if the main question is, how is one to live as a Christian, perhaps we might consider the role that sanctification or growth in holiness might play in relation to the problems created by both Augustine and Pelagius, rather than focusing solely on the question of securing salvation. For example, if Pelagius, as Jay noted, in effect collapses the two tiers of Christianity by moving everyone onto the first tier, we are all called to be the spiritual elites. I wonder if he has, not Jay, but Pelagius, in part confused the issue of justification or salvation with the question of sanctification, or the maturing and growth in holiness expected of all Christians, with, of course, the assistance of the Holy Spirit and participation in the ecclesia, in the fellowship of the saints. Which brings me to babies. I was struck by Peter Brown's contrast that Jay cites in his paper between Augustine's view of himself as a baby on his mother's breast, utterly dependent, and Pelagius's view of the Christian as a son or a child, but a grown one, presumably, no longer dependent in any way on the parent. Both, of course, find their proponents in Scripture. Psalm 131, for example, which has always been my favorite psalm, says, "I have stilled and quieted my soul, like a weaned child with its mother." Thus, Augustine. But on the other hand, the author of Hebrews gives us the image of Christians moving on to maturity and adulthood, as it were, no longer fed on milk, but on meat, on solid food. Therefore, I see no reason why we can't accept both as faithful, if tensive, images of the Christian journey with God, although I would reject the Pelagian note that independence is somehow constitutive of maturity. Maturity, in fact, strikes me as not only an increase in our own sense of responsibility, but an ever-deepening awareness of and dependence on God's grace. So, 2, spiritual lassitude or indifferentism. The paper admits that Augustine, quote, would labor mightily to establish that all Christians should strive to pursue the good, end quote. This is page 18. The paper seems to take this as a contradiction, and it seems on the face of it that it is, that if Augustine were true to his own teaching, it would lead to, quote, despair and moral lassitude, from page 19. But I wonder, tentatively, if concerns about predestination as the path to moral laxity or indifference is a genuine problem or a perceived one that has never materialized in practice. I've been worshiping in a Presbyterian church for the last year or two, and believe me, these people are prone neither to moral lassitude nor indifference nor despair. In addition, Augustine's own life seems to bear witness to precisely the opposite. In Joseph Bernardin's essay on Augustine as pastor, Bernardin writes that Augustine taught the necessity of repentance and prayer, exhorted the rich to give to the poor as if to Christ himself, emphasized the danger of hearing the word but not doing it, taught that the Christian life was a life of discipline and that spiritual growth required perseverance, and that all of this, of course, were gifts of grace, grace all the way down, but that this let nobody off the hook in terms of daily practice. Here is Jay's paper's own description of Augustine's churches. Regular folks, neither monastic elites nor Pelagian perfectionists, stumbling along trying to be faithful. Augustine recognized that wheat and tares were sown together and that it was perilous to try to disentangle them. The sovereign choice of God did not excuse Augustine, him, from preaching faithfully and offering the sacraments. It did not excuse them, Augustine's congregants, from the call to obedience. This sounds to me like a description of a long obedience in the same direction, not a description of indifferentism. It sounds, I suspect, a little bit like all of us, regular folks, neither monastic elites nor Pelagian perfectionists, stumbling along, trying to be faithful. Therefore, I confess that I fear Pelagius may have cast an even longer shadow over at least parts of the church than Augustine. And I say that as someone who is not at all Augustinian on the question of double predestination. But tell me which you find more worrisome. Christians who think their salvation requires nothing more than mental assent or a simple prayer, but who fail to practice justice and show mercy and participate in the practices of the worshiping community. Or what about Christians who tear themselves to pieces, worried that their prayer wasn't good enough, that it wasn't sincere enough, that there is some unforgivable sin they are sure to commit, that God's grace will eventually wear thin in the face of their continual small everyday sins? I wonder if we are living in Pelagius's shadow just as much as Augustine's, not because we have inherited his icy perfectionism, for the most part, but in the widespread belief in unfettered human capacity, freely to choose or reject God, in the elevation of free will and human decision as paramount, in the thousand tiny ways we try to earn God's favor or assure ourselves of our salvation. The hardest lesson I've ever learned as a Christian myself is that I am a beloved child of God, and that is the end of that sentence. I was fortunate to be here on Thursday, and this is my final thought, to hear Beverly Gaventa's marvelous Lund lectures, and her reflections on Romans made me wonder if Pelagius underestimated or misdiagnosed the extent of the problem, whereas Augustine perhaps misdiagnosed or underestimated the extent of God's solution. That is to say, Pelagius fails to see that only God can rescue us from this body of death, whereas Augustine's view that God saves only some seems to fall short of the scriptural witness to the redemption of all creation. But since I am a New Testament scholar, like Jay, I come to the same conclusion that Paul himself might be the best and most reliable guide we have to navigate the thorny question of the tension between divine grace and human responsibility. So if the primary question is, how is one to live as a Christian, here are just a few words of exhortation from Paul that could well take a lifetime for us to fulfill. Present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life. And last of all, in a delightful apparent contradiction, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jay and Rebekah. We'll move now into conversation. And before turning it over to Jay for a first response, say that when it comes time for question and answer, please speak into the microphone so that those who are joining us by live stream can remain in the conversation. And please introduce yourself and try to keep your questions brief and questions.
Thanks, Rebekah. I really appreciate that. And a couple of things I want to respond to. You're absolutely right. And one of the points I was making about Augustine as a pastor, and something I was talking to Stephen about, that in spite of a theology that would suggest that there was nothing one could do to be obedient to God in one's own power, certainly in Calvin you have this powerful affirmation of the necessity of obedience, and whatever the theology was, there was no slacking off in moral expectation of growth in grace, and I would observe about that is it almost makes me wonder, and maybe this is unfair, if that the sort of predestinarian view was over here as kind of a theological reality that became a pragmatic fiction. That you had this view, but still you couldn't totally live out of the powerful framework of fate or determinism that's implied by that. However, Augustine in particular struggled against the notion that this was fate, and he was accused of that, and he rejected that because that was a pagan notion. But still, there seemed to be this contradiction between a high level of moral expectation on the one hand, and the idea that human action really makes no difference on the other. The other observation I would make is that the parable of the wheat and the tares became a trope that eventually found its way into European state churches that would sort of literally baptize a whole people with the notion that somehow God would know who were His. And I think that so that, no, it did not have to go to indifferentism. You have plenty of examples when it didn't. But that became, in the sort of eventual Constantinian agreement, a trope that enabled a number of people to look at existence as a Christian in what I would call a rather indifferent way. And so you have then the value of the monastic movement calling people to another level of faithfulness that they weren't seeing in the congregation in general. And that to say that was a result of Augustinianism would be unfair, but it is something that became characteristic of the wedding between church and state that dominated Christianity for so long. And thank you for those words from Paul as well. I find those quite congenial too. So I'll stop there, and we'll let whoever wants to have at me do so.
Open it up for questions, please. And the microphone is okay. Max has the microphone.
You have to help me out.
Yeah, Dr. Gaventa.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm still Beverly Gaventa.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of snakes on the table here. I've had to try to decide how to limit my responses to two very stimulating presentations. I guess the thing I want to say just briefly about Romans 2 and elsewhere is that I don't think statements about judgment in Paul should be isolated from statements about mercy. Here I am ripping off a doctoral student of mine, and so I will need to apologize to him later. But at least in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, when Israel is judged, does not mean Israel also will not receive mercy. So even in Romans 2 is at the beginning of the letter. I don't think it means that there's not mercy to be had. And I would think about the difference between the end of Romans 9 and the end of Romans 11 to talk about that. And now I guess the question that I would like to hear more discussion of here is, yes, the gospel calls for, I would say the gospel generates, the gospel makes possible human action, Christian obedience. What is that for? It seems to me to be an important question here. Is it, and this is how I was brought up, it's to secure my, be sure I'm on the good side and don't fry. Is that really what we think Paul is saying? Is that really what we think God wants from us? Or is Christian action, is spiritual growth a byproduct of the love of God that's poured into our hearts? Is it because of who we have been made to be? Is it because we can do now things that we could not do before? So to me, it's the question of what is the end of human action? Is it to secure safety for ourselves, or is it some larger, even doxological goal?
I'll say, and then you can make your own kind of response too. When I was citing Romans 2, I was not meaning to isolate judgment from mercy at all. Merely to say that I think Paul is able to hold things in tension that sometimes we aren't evidently able to do. And this was quite characteristic. I quoted the famous passage in Rabbi Akiva, all things are determined but freedom of choice is given, and he goes on to talk more about that. And my reading of that is the outcome of God's outcome, God's eschatological outcome is set. God knows what God is going to do, but within that, we have the choice to follow God or not. And as opposed to talk about the purpose, I would not mean at all to suggest that obedience is a way of gaining God's favor and a way of securing my salvation. But disobedience to God is certainly a way of calling that into question, and it's certainly a way of raising the question of what understanding one has of the grace of God in one's life. I'm not trying to put, in using Klein's article, I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but as we've talked about it, I think what he says there about any understanding of Christian existence, Christian life, of salvation, it doesn't include the expectation of obedience, has somehow missed a major part of what Paul is trying to say. And this is why I think Beck accuses Christianity of a form of romanticism, that human salvation does not require anything other than the action of God, then human beings in that case, as I said about sort of have potentially been infantilized. So, maybe it's a part of a tension that we have to find a way to hold together. The clear expectation that God's salvation is by God's gracious love and choice of us in Christ. And at the same time, our failure to obey raises some serious questions about what that salvation entails. Rebekah, do you want to?
So I will just say very briefly that I think the question of what obedience is for expresses more elegantly than I did what I meant by saying it might be helpful to separate, at least in some respect, justification from sanctification, from the concept of growth in grace. So that gets at what I was trying to do. Thank you.
Stephen Chester.
Thank you, Stephen Chester. Jay, I thought you were profoundly right that there's a strong connection between theology in Augustine and Pelagius' context and ecclesiology and sociology. But I did wonder if you were, a little unfair to Augustine in ways that led to the simplification of that connection.
Probably.
I think what he's trying to do, or what he thinks he's doing, is operating on an understanding that because we're creatures, then when our human agency is separated from divine agency, we're enslaved. And the only way our will can actually be free and human agency can be restored is to be enfolded within divine agency. And so, when you said it's all God, ultimately for Augustine, I'm not sure he would accept that as an account of what he's doing. And also in terms of, his ethic for ordinary Christian life, baptism is extremely important for him.
Yeah.
And so when somebody has been baptized and has received the Spirit, then he does develop an account that I think you can see in his sermons on Romans 7 of obedience for the ordinary Christian, which is about, okay, we live in the fallen world, we therefore still experience sinful desires, but what the Spirit does is give us the capacity to resist those desires. And I think that's problematic as an interpretation of some of Paul's terms in Romans 7, and it raises also various pastoral problems, I think. But it is an ethics of obedience for ordinary Christians. And so this is a long way to get to the question. My question is this: you finished with a kind of cri de coeur about obedience in the present day context. Having connected sociological patterns and theology and ecclesiology with Augustine and Pelagius, and I'm wanting to say that's it's complex, but it's there. What do you think the sociology of obedience looks like in the contemporary context? Nice small question.
Yeah. Well, let me say a couple of things. First, one of the things that I kept, as I was reading this summer in particular, I kept wanting to ask all of the folk in this conversation. Augustine, Calvin, both of them will say something like this about it is people are incapable of doing the good without the intervention of the grace of God, or willing the good. So I'm thinking, okay, are you saying that every pagan mother that loves her child because she's not experienced the grace of God in Christ is incapable of willing the good? Really? That no one outside of being baptized and experiencing the grace of Christ can will the good? It seemed to me a sort of a parochial reading. Now I know the Bardians are out there saying, "Oh my gosh, natural theology," but I have a hard time with that sort of stricture that would suggest that only someone who has experienced the grace of God through Christ is able to will the good, and that's what he seems to be saying. And I'm willing to be corrected on that, but that's something that has troubled me. How does Augustine give an account? And he's asked about this in a couple of places, and he talks about the account of the good pagan, and he has a hard time dealing with that question. On the other one, on the sociology question, I think that Rebekah, raising the specter of a kind of backdoor Pelagianism is a very apt reminder that with all of our sort of individualism, we do have this kind of and it's not Pelagianism in the sense of Christian perfectionism, but it's Pelagianism in the sense of people being able to do whatever they you're told as a child, you can be whatever you want to do, you can be whatever you want to be, you can accomplish everything. And so there is a kind of a backdoor Pelagianism and an unwillingness in many circles to deal with the clear brokenness of human life. And I think she's right about that. That maybe at that point a more Augustinian conversation for the wider society is important. On the other hand, I think very often, at least in the circles that I've experienced in the Christian world, there is if you start talking about obedience to the will of God, you're accused of sounding like an old fundamentalist or something. And I find that problematic as well. And this does not mean that all of the questions about what the will of God is in a particular circumstance are going to be easy to discern. And that's why I talked about the sort of rabbinic kind of conversations. But I think there's not one sociology. There's a couple of interlocking ones that may require different messages for different audiences. Rebekah, do you want to comment on that? Okay.
Dr. Lim? Oh, do I have the wrong? Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no, the church historian.
All right. Well, thank you for this very intriguing paper. It's part comment and part question, I suppose. I wondered, granted the fact that you weren't preparing this paper for this months ago, but I wondered about the genre within the Augustinian corpus, for example. That kind of hardline, kind of predestinarian kind of theology shows up very brightly, maybe darkly, I don't know, whatever term you might choose, on free choice of the will and also in City of God. But when you look at the City of God in terms of natural theology, or can pagans do any good, his apologetic aim in that City of God is to show precisely that pagans ought to have known better, but their refusal to know better has led them to this kind of particular pernicious pathway. So that's one. And then the other is, I don't know whether you looked at some of the sermons by Augustine, because when you imagine yourself preaching in front of your parishioners,
Right.
You have to allow for some volitional capacity, at least within that parish, to hear what you're saying as the Spirit of God is moving you to respond. So no matter how hard a double predestinarian you may be, in the pulpit praxis, you cannot assume that those are just mute stones that cannot move their hearts, because Augustine in the sacramental theology assumes that all the ecclesial acts, including that of the pastor or priest, is motivated by and empowered by the Spirit of God. Therefore, it has that sacramental efficacy in and of itself, including the auditor's capacity. So there is that sort of sacramental marinating of that kind of particular context that I think would be quite helpful to make this argument a little bit suppler. And the other thing is, for example, in his, just written about this, so in his Gospel of John, there's a lot of synergistic language that the Johannine corpus presents itself. So I think in some ways Augustine, when he's talking about Romans, he can take much more hardline approach of can the kind of pot speak to the potter and so on and so forth. But then, so both in his tractates on John, but also in his Psalms commentary, he really allows the text to lead, and whether it is talking, when it is talking about divine sovereignty, and he lets it have it, but also at the same time when it really assumes and asserts human self-assertion and also cooperation, I think he does that as well. So my question to come back to it is, have you considered these other texts, and if you do, what would the sort of the hardline typology that you've presented look like?
Thank you very much. Let me say a couple of things. This is a shaft, sort of a mine shaft I've sunk into this topic because this summer I became so fascinated with it. And it's not like I'd never read Augustine before, but I never read as much Augustine as I read this summer. And I want to be fair. I loved reading Augustine. I find Augustine absolutely fascinating and wonderful in a lot of ways. I've told people there were times I wanted to reach into the page and hug him, and there were times I wanted to reach in and strangle him. There's this, and Augustine wrote a lot of stuff over a lot of years, And at the end, he comes back and he writes this thing in retractions where he tries to kind of set the record straight. I think it's fair to say that some of the hardline stuff that he's writing in response to Pelagius is in the last 4 or 5 years of his life, and it's writing in response to what he saw rightly, I think, as a serious challenge to future health of the church. And I recognize that I need to do some wider reading and more careful reading in Augustine. And I thought when I was writing this paper, it could suffer the death at 1,000 qualifications, or I could quote Luther, sin boldly. So I decided to sin boldly and hope that in generating some conversation, I would get some help in furthering what I see as a longer project. Because not only is this a theological issue and a missional and spiritual issue for the church, it's a huge ongoing question in the wider society among the neuroscientists about what do humans really have agency at all? Sociologists raise questions, psychologists. A lot of people nowadays are wondering about human agency in general, whether there's even such a thing. And I have a friend of mine that thinks that that free will is a creation of the Enlightenment, and that it's no such thing. And so we do have people on this sort of side of things that want to deny human agency, and then we have sort of a laissez-faire a feeling that we can do and be anything that we want to do based upon our own decisions. And I know that Augustine was a good pastor who preached the word and called his people to repentance and faithfulness, and I've read many of his sermons. I've read many of the letters. There's a lot of stuff I need to read and that I haven't read and need to read more carefully. But I appreciate your suggestion, and it may ameliorate some of the rather strong bifurcation that I had there. One of the things I said at the beginning of the paper is that New Testament scholars cannot ignore how texts have been read for the last 2,000 years. And I think sometimes that's been for me a kind of a comforting thing. I can ignore what those church fathers said and what everybody else has said. But no, we can't pretend that those years haven't passed. So reading Augustine's sermons and his reflections on the text, and the others as well, I have to say that I found Cassian's Conference 13 very attractive because of the way he quotes and uses Scripture there. And I found his account pretty compelling. And it's another one I want to do some more work with. But I welcome any suggestions and thank you for your comments.
Jonathan? Next, or the microphone?
I was chatting with our online viewers. Sorry.
The way I keep it brief is I write it out. Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Phelan. Thank you so much, Dr. Eklund, for your response. I was really blessed by both. In Pia Desideria, Spener quotes Luther's Intro to Romans, "It is a mighty thing, this faith. It cannot help but do good works continually." I wonder if there is a Pelagian mediocrity that we have seen take root in the modern era. Historian Paul Johnson touts a Pelagian ethical view traced through Erasmus into what he thinks is liberal Christianity. And he touts it. And in my opinion, what Johnson is touting is essentially that a middle-class morality with occasional fits of paternalistic generosity to the less fortunate is really the path to salvation. And that the middle-class attenders of church who will do these things in themselves, in their own will, are on the right track, as though this is what Luther meant by the power of faith. Or put another way, is Pelagian mediocrity a possibility? And if so, where do we find it?
You know, thank you, John. I really, you read Pelagius, and it's hard to imagine that he would not have looked on what you have described with anything other than utter scorn. He would have been, you know, just scornful of that kind of view. At least it seems to me. Now, let me hasten to say we don't have a whole lot from Pelagius, and some of what we have has been filtered through his critics, and some of the letters that we have may or may not be from Pelagius. We don't know for sure. One of the most comical things was that a letter that has been, in the last century or so identified as Pelagius for many years was identified as the letter of Jerome. Jerome would have had a fit if he thought that a letter of Pelagius was identified as one of his. Jerome being one of the great theological thugs of the Christian world. But I find Pelagian mediocrity, and you heard me, I'm no supporter of Pelagius. I think if we had gone that route, it would have been disastrous because we'd have ended up like the Shakers. There wouldn't have been anybody left. But if there's a kind of mediocrity that's grown out of Pelagianism, it's grown out of a very serious misunderstanding of what Pelagius was trying to do anyway, what his project was. And so it would be a very reduced and sapped Pelagianism if that was the case.
Other questions? There's currently no lineup. Jody. Wait.
Oh, hold on.
But the one bubbling up within me has something to do with, it feels to me that the people on the side of Augustine, the Calvinists, Barth, and Gaventa, have this beautiful cosmic narrative to work with to some degree on some forms of working out the Calvinism. And I always feel like in my Mennonite, I always feel like, oh, and we get to write the handbooks, right? And it feels like it's this genre difference, right? And I'm so attracted to the cosmic and the beauty of it. But is there something that's just aesthetic there? And that, some days life is just the books. You just have to grind it through. And you're writing 1 Corinthians, this is what you're supposed to do about the beat offered to idols. And you're not writing any preface to, Romans, I just don't know. Do you think that's, and I wonder that because it feels like big minds are attracted to Calvinism. And they have been over time, and it always feels like you're kind of on the low end of the swimming pool, even if you think you're right. I mean, that's my issue, that I think it's right. I think it's right, but I don't know how to make it beautiful and cosmic.
Yeah.
So I'm throwing you a big, weird ball, but...
When I was in my doctoral program at Northwestern, I had a professor who had known Karl Barth, and he looked at me one time and he said, "That old man had a phone on his desk directly connected with God." And I think that was part of what he was saying. There was the sort of intricate, cosmic vision of Barth, of Calvin, and of Augustine. There is a certain remarkable beauty to it. At the same time, the sort of coherence of that vision can sometimes be seductive as well. The beauty of systematizing, I've seen that in a lot of New Testament scholars who have a vision of what a particular book or concept means, and it's so intricate that if you pull one thread, the whole thing disentangles. And I was not raised in that tradition, and my My theological background has never been that sort of beautiful coherence. I will say, though, with all the messiness and complication of someone like Paul, even in the midst of the messiness of writing letters to misbehaving Corinthians, there is an underlying beauty there. There is a coherence that I don't think we want to make too coherent, but because then we rob Paul of a lot of his life. But there's a reason why Calvin and Augustine and all of these people found such beauty in Paul and were able to communicate. I mean, read Romans 8 and think about this sort of whole cosmic thing, or 1 Corinthians 15 for that matter. The notion of God being all in all. There's a reason for Paul being the apostle, and also for him being the source of argument between Jews and Christians particularly, but within and between Christians as well. So I feel your pain, Jody.
Yes. Larry.
Larry Camphausen. I'm thinking about your title, really, The Long Shadow of Augustine, and wondering if a lot of what you're dealing with isn't Augustine, but that we've made him a systematic theologian. And I wonder, some of the comments have made me think, well, maybe that's misidentifying. Maybe his contradictions are there because that's not what he's about. So if you try to put him in front of a systematic theology class, he'd be a very bad professor. Maybe that's okay. And the other aspect of my comment/question is, what if we read him as the Eastern Orthodox read him, rather than as this great giant that we all have to follow after, as opposed to, oh yeah, just another saint. Yes, a saint, but just another saint like Saint Gregory and Saint Basil and the Gregories and any number of other patristics that have equal weight. And I wonder if that long shadow is that in the West we only read Augustine.
Well, the thing, I was talking to Stephen about this, that the thing about Augustine, like Paul, he was an occasional writer. That all this stuff about Pelagianism was written in response to letters or reports that he had from somebody else. And so he was involved in controversy. He was involved in controversy over the Donatists. He was involved in controversy, over the paganism and the Manichaeism and so forth. So you're right, Larry. He's not. This is not Karl Barth writing systematic theology. This is a bishop addressing challenges in the life of his congregation and the wider congregation. This is a pastor trying to address questions of how the Christian community should, individuals within the Christian community should live out their life, and how the emerging order of the church should relate to the changing order of the Roman Empire, which was during his lifetime in this time of transition. And then, as I said earlier, it's almost comical to read. The Calvin and Pigius and Gottschalk and Erigena, they both use Augustine as an authority for very different views, but they quote different parts of Augustine at different times, because Augustine said different stuff at different times, and so they all consider him authority, but they all use him in different ways. And people who have read On Divine Predestination by Erigena, I think rightly say that, yeah, Erigena used Augustine, but he misused him. It wouldn't be the first time Augustine had been misused by somebody who saw him as an authority. So I think rather than have him be the sort of answer man to every theological question, to recognize the arguments that went on within conflictual situations. Pelagius was a flea that Augustine killed with a sledgehammer, and maybe something a little bit lighter weight would have been better for him and for us. On the other hand, maybe that it needed that much weight to deal with the question. But I think we need to recognize the occasional nature of those writings.
Ty.
Hi, Ty Grigg. I was really intrigued, Jay, by your comment at the end of your paper on communities of practice, and just wanted to give you a chance to maybe flesh that out more. About you had cited that ancient Israel and the early church both being communities of practice, in ways that the church today might enter into that idea of being the church as a community of practice, and maybe even wondering about what practices you would exhort us to, and also what dangers there might be.
Yeah. Well, this is a conversation that's been going on for a while in a couple of directions. You have, sort of Alistair McIntyre and After Virtue making the case for the formational character of practices, and whether these practices have to do with the way we worship, with particular patterns of life, or whether these practices have to do with how we read text. Over the last several years, I've developed a good friendship with a modern Orthodox rabbi, and we meet a couple of times a month to read New Testament together. When he came to see me the first time, he said, I want to read Romans with you. So it took us 3 years to get through Romans. And now we're up to 1 Corinthians 9, and we've been reading it for about 3 years too. So we're moving rather slowly. But one of the things I've learned in conversation with him, there's a long tradition that they have of reading texts together. And my concern that in a lot of the churches I'm familiar with, the practices of reading texts together, it's either left to the clergy to read the text, or it's either left to people to sit around with the text and say, well, I don't know, what do you think? And not have a very sophisticated way of reading these texts communally and asking what it means, and letting the opinions come out without those of us that have the training squashing people before they have a chance. I've said to students, reclaim your role as teacher. Reclaim your role as teacher of the text and the tradition. And reclaim the church's role as a place where one of the practices is the communal reading of text. Whether that text is the Bible, that text is the culture and society, whether that text is a movie. There are a number of different texts. But I think a communal practice of reading text is one of the chief absences in my observation that would need to be addressed. And I think the notion of the Christian faith as practiced is another thing that gets lost in a lot of Protestant. You hear about someone being a practicing Catholic. You don't ever hear somebody being a practicing evangelical. The notion of practicing one's faith is not one that we often think of in the Protestant world. And I would like some greater conversation how we might think about what that practice might look like. Now, I think Roman Catholic would say they need some conversations on that too. It's not that they figure that out, what that looks like. But there are parts of our Protestant world in which people do this better than is done in the evangelical world, or at least have a tradition of doing so. And I hope we can, both in the wider Protestant and evangelical world, find those places. Recently, a local priest in the Episcopal Church has asked me to come in and meet with her leadership once a month to do theological reflection on texts and issues, because she recognizes that this is something they don't do very well. Well, that's kind of exciting to me, to be able to sit with a group of leaders in that church. It's just less than a mile from my house once a month, and just talk with them about those issues of Scripture and theology that they're concerned about, excited about. I don't think there's brain surgery here, but I think we need to find ways to reclaiming some parts of our reflective heritage I think we've lost.
I believe there's time for one more question. Is there any burning questions out there? Please, Trevor.
Trevor Stillen, third-year MDiv student. I just was hoping wondering if you could flesh out your when you're talking about the history of Protestantism and how there's a tendency for perfectionism to creep in there. Can you flesh that out a little bit? How you've seen that throughout the history of Protestantism?
Yeah, I mean, you just look at the proliferation of denominations, and somebody's not perfect in their. Look, I grew up in the Plymouth Brethren, for goodness sake. You don't even know what that is. We are the kings of division, you know. We would divide over anything if somebody didn't have the exact right interpretation of a particular text. And I think there's such a long history of this, of a sort of a theological perfectionism, and I always see it replicated in mainline denominations to this day, that we can't figure out a way to put up with each other, so we go out and create another denomination. And I'm not saying that theological differences aren't significant or important, but I think at least a part of that is a desire to be with the gathered saints who have it all together, you know, rather than be with a bunch of people who are struggling to be faithful to God and don't always get it right and have differences of opinion about some really important stuff. But rather than living with those important differences, we either leave or beat the heck out of each other, or both. And I think that's a form at its base of a kind of perfectionism that has been incredibly destructive. And you know, it's not without reason that people outside of the church look on us and say, "Why would we want to have anything to do with you people? You can't get along with each other." Well, yeah, I'm sorry, but that's not a bad complaint on their part, actually. So that's what I was getting at, Trevor.
I think that brings us to a close. So let's thank Jay and